I never thought I would be the type of person to get into a war with my HOA president, but then again, I never thought I would meet someone quite like Karen Hendricks. When I first moved into Willow Creek Estates, I was just looking for a quiet place to work remotely and enjoy the suburban lifestyle. The neighborhood seemed perfect with its manicured lawns, tree-lined streets, and that classic American dream aesthetic. I had just sold my tech startup for a comfortable sum, nothing flashy, but enough that I could afford a nice home and not worry too much about working for a while. I was looking forward to peace and quiet. What I got instead was Karen. Karen was the kind of HOA president who treated the position like she was running a small dictatorship. She was in her late 50s, always dressed like she was about to attend a country club luncheon, and she had this particular way of smiling that never quite reached her eyes. You know the type, someone who had probably been told no a few times in life and decided that having a tiny amount of power over a suburban neighborhood would be her way of making sure that never happened again. Within my first week, I received 3 notices from the HOA. The first was about my mailbox being 0.3 inches too tall according to the community guidelines. The second was about parking my car in my own driveway at an angle that was apparently not perpendicular enough to the street. The third was about my trash cans being visible from the street for approximately 12 minutes past the allowed time on collection day. If you are enjoying this story of how I dealt with my nightmare HOA president, please hit that like button and subscribe to Karen Eat World for more tales of entitled people getting exactly what they deserve. Trust me, you will want to see where this one goes. I tried to handle things diplomatically at first. I adjusted my mailbox. I made sure to park perfectly straight, and I set alarms to ensure my trash cans were tucked away within seconds of collection. I even baked cookies and brought them to Karen's house, introducing myself properly and trying to start on a better foot. She took the cookies, sniffed them suspiciously, and told me that homemade food gifts were actually against HOA policy due to potential allergen concerns. Then she handed me another violation notice for having a welcome mat that was hunter green instead of the approved forest green. I honestly could not tell the difference, but apparently Karen could, and apparently it mattered. The violations kept coming. My porch light was too bright. My garden gnome was considered lawn clutter. The wreath on my front door was too large by 2 inches. I started to realize that Karen was not just enforcing rules, she was targeting me specifically. I would see her walking past other houses with identical violations, lawn decorations, slightly off-color shutters, oversized mailboxes, and she would not say a word. But my house? She would patrol past it twice a day with a clipboard and a measuring tape. I decided to attend an HOA meeting to address this directly. Surely, I thought, the other board members would see that this was excessive. The meeting was held in Karen's living room, which should have been my first clue. The other board members were essentially Karen's personal fan club, 2 retired women who nodded at everything she said and a man who seemed primarily interested in the free coffee and cookies. When I politely brought up that I had received 14 violation notices in 6 weeks while my neighbor had a literal car on blocks in his backyard with 0 violations, Karen smiled that cold smile and said that the HOA addressed violations as they were reported, and that perhaps my neighbor simply had fewer concerned citizens paying attention to his property. That was when I knew this was personal. I just did not know why yet. I started doing some research, both on Karen and on HOA law in our state. What I found was interesting. Karen had been HOA president for 8 years, which was unusual because the bylaws stated that the position should rotate every 2 years. When I dug into the meeting minutes, which were public record, I found that for the past 6 years, Karen had been the only person to run for president because, coincidentally, the nomination period was only announced at meetings that were scheduled with less than 48 hours' notice, and the meetings were held at times when most working people could not attend. I also discovered something else interesting. In my previous life, before selling my company, I had worked extensively with property law and zoning regulations. It was how my startup had made its money, providing software solutions for real estate developers to navigate complex legal requirements. I knew more about property codes, easements, and municipal regulations than most lawyers. And I was about to put that knowledge to use. The breaking point came when Karen issued a violation for my security camera. I had installed it after someone kept leaving violation notices on my door at odd hours. I wonder who? The camera was small, discreet, and mounted under my eave pointing at my own front door. Karen claimed it violated privacy regulations because it could potentially see the sidewalk, which was community property. She demanded I remove it within 72 hours or face a $500 fine. Instead of removing it, I filed a request for a hearing, which was my right under the HOA bylaws. Karen was furious but had to grant it. At the hearing, I brought printouts of the relevant state laws showing that security cameras pointing at one's own property were legally protected, even if they incidentally captured public spaces. I also brought photos of 3 other houses in the neighborhood with similar cameras, none of which had received violations. Karen dismissed all of this, saying that those cameras had been grandfathered in and that new installations required approval. When I pointed out that there was nothing in the HOA documents about grandfathering or requiring pre-approval for security devices, she simply said that as president, she had the authority to interpret the rules as needed for community harmony. That was when I realized Karen was not just petty, she was operating the HOA like her personal fiefdom, and no amount of reasoning was going to change that. So I stopped trying to reason. Instead, I started planning. I spent the next 2 weeks conducting what I called research. I reviewed every single HOA meeting minute from the past 8 years. I obtained copies of all financial records, which were technically available to homeowners upon request, though Karen made me submit the request in writing 3 times before finally producing them. I studied our neighborhood's original development plans, zoning classifications, and city ordinances. And I made some phone calls to old colleagues, including a few who now worked in city planning and one who had become a real estate attorney specializing in HOA disputes. What I discovered was a gold mine. Karen had been running the HOA like her personal bank account. There were irregularities everywhere. Funds allocated for community improvements that never happened. Contracts awarded to her brother-in-law's landscaping company at rates well above market value. Fines collected but never properly documented. And then there was the big one. The community pool and clubhouse, which we all paid monthly fees to maintain, were actually on a parcel of land that Karen had quietly transferred into her own name 3 years ago through some creative paperwork during a period when she was both HOA president and acting treasurer. I could have simply reported her to the authorities right then, but that seemed too quick, too impersonal. Karen had spent months making my life miserable over paint colors and mailbox heights. I wanted her to feel the same kind of powerless frustration she had inflicted on me and probably countless others. So I crafted a plan that was beautiful in its complexity, and completely, utterly legal. First, I started attending every HOA meeting, which annoyed Karen to no end. I would ask detailed questions about expenditures, request clarifications on rules, and generally make myself a polite but persistent presence. I also started talking to neighbors. It turned out I was far from the only person Karen had targeted. There was a young couple she had fined repeatedly for having a baby stroller visible in their garage. An elderly man who had received violations for his grass being a 1/4 inch too long while he was recovering from surgery. A woman who had been cited for her children's chalk drawings on her own driveway. People were fed up, but they felt powerless because Karen controlled the board and seemed to know every loophole to maintain that control. I organized a neighborhood coffee meeting, just a casual get-together at the local cafe, and invited everyone who had received what seemed like excessive violations. 37 people showed up. We shared stories, compared notes, and I explained some of the irregularities I had found in the HOA finances. More importantly, I explained that there was a mechanism in our HOA bylaws for calling a special election if 20% of homeowners signed a petition. We had more than enough signatures by the end of that meeting. When I submitted the petition to Karen, following every procedural requirement to the letter, I watched her face turn an impressive shade of red. She tried to claim the signatures had not been properly notarized, even though the bylaws did not require notarization. She tried to say that the petition format was incorrect, even though I had used the exact template from the HOA governing documents. Finally, she had no choice but to schedule the special election, though she set it for 8 weeks out, the maximum time allowed, clearly hoping people would lose interest. They did not lose interest. If anything, they became more engaged. I helped several neighbors organize a slate of candidates for the board positions. We created a simple website outlining proposed changes, transparency in finances, reasonable enforcement of rules, and an end to selective targeting. Karen fought back by sending out mass emails about the dangers of letting outsiders take over the community, conveniently ignoring that I and everyone else involved actually lived there. She implied that I was some kind of troublemaker trying to destroy property values. She even tried to issue me a violation for campaign materials, claiming my simple website somehow violated solicitation rules. But here is where my plan really came together. While all this election drama was unfolding, I had been working on something else entirely. Remember how I mentioned that Karen had transferred the pool and clubhouse property into her own name? Well, I had my real estate attorney friend look into that, and it turned out that transfer was not exactly legal. The property had been deeded to the HOA in the original development documents, and Karen did not have the authority to transfer it, even as president. It required a vote of the full membership, which had never happened. I could have simply challenged the transfer legally, but again, where is the poetry in that? Instead, I did something more creative. I discovered that the property transfer, while fraudulent, had created a situation where the land was now in a weird legal limbo. It was not properly part of the HOA anymore, but Karen's ownership was also not legitimate. And here is the beautiful part, there was a 2-week window where the property was essentially unencumbered due to the questionable title status. Through a shell LLC I had set up, I quietly purchased the tax lien on the property, which Karen had apparently forgotten to pay in her confusion about whether she owned it personally or the HOA did. In our state, that gave me certain rights. I then filed a quiet title action, a legal procedure to establish ownership of property when the title is unclear. I had all the documentation showing that Karen's transfer was invalid, that she had not properly maintained the property taxes, and that the original HOA deed had specific clauses about what would happen if the property was ever abandoned or improperly transferred. Those clauses essentially said it would revert to being available for purchase by any member of the community. So I purchased it. Legally, properly, and completely above board. The community pool and clubhouse that everyone had been paying fees to maintain. I now owned them. And here is where it gets even better. I immediately filed the proper paperwork with the city to rezone my newly acquired property from community recreational use to private residential use. Then I announced that I would be converting the pool into a koi pond and the clubhouse into a private studio, which was entirely within my rights as the property owner. The neighborhood exploded. But not at me, at Karen. Because everyone quickly understood what had happened. Karen had stolen community property, and in doing so, had made it vulnerable to exactly this kind of situation. People were furious with her. The special election, which was now just a week away, became less about normal HOA politics and more about holding Karen accountable. But I was not done yet. I also filed a formal complaint with the state's Consumer Protection Division, which oversees HOA operations, detailing all the financial irregularities I had found. I provided documentation of the sweetheart contracts, the missing funds, and the fraudulent property transfer. I sent copies to every homeowner in the neighborhood, along with a letter explaining that while I had purchased the pool and clubhouse property, I was willing to deed it back to the community under new HOA leadership that would operate transparently and legally. Karen tried to fight back. She sent threatening letters claiming I had somehow stolen community property, conveniently ignoring her own theft. She tried to rally her supporters, but they had mostly abandoned her once the financial irregularities came to light. She even showed up at my door one evening, furious and demanding that I undo everything. I calmly explained that I had simply followed the same approach she had taught me, using rules and regulations to achieve my goals, except I had stayed within legal boundaries. The special election was a landslide. Karen and her entire board were voted out, and a new board was installed with a mandate for transparency and fairness. But the real consequences for Karen were just beginning. The state investigation I had triggered started moving forward. Auditors showed up to review HOA records. The irregular contracts were flagged. The missing funds were noticed. And the fraudulent property transfer? That caught the attention of the district attorney's office. I was actually in my home office when I heard the commotion outside. Multiple police cars had pulled up to Karen's house, which was just 3 doors down from mine. I walked out onto my porch, coffee in hand, and watched as officers approached her door. Through my security camera system, the one Karen had tried so hard to make me remove, I had a perfect view. Karen answered the door in her usual put-together outfit, probably expecting to sign for a package or speak to a neighbor. Instead, she was greeted by 2 detectives who identified themselves and asked if they could come in to talk. I could not hear the conversation from where I stood, but I could see Karen's face change from confusion to alarm to outright panic as they spoke to her on her doorstep. The conversation lasted about 15 minutes before one of the detectives said something that made Karen's face go completely white. She started shaking her head, gesturing emphatically, her voice rising loud enough that I could catch snippets about misunderstandings and clerical errors. The detective calmly pulled out a document, a warrant, and Karen's knees actually seemed to buckle slightly. What Karen did not know, what she could not have known because she was too busy playing petty tyrant over Mailbox Heights, was that my old colleague who had become a real estate attorney. His sister was an assistant district attorney who specialized in fraud cases. When I had brought him the HOA financial irregularities, he had mentioned them to her in passing. She had found them interesting enough to open a preliminary investigation. And once that investigation started pulling threads, the whole sweater unraveled. The missing HOA funds? Over $80,000 across 3 years. The fraudulent property transfer? Felony fraud. The sweetheart contracts with her brother-in-law? Embezzlement and potentially racketeering since it involved ongoing fraudulent activity. Karen had not just been a petty tyrant, she had been running an actual criminal enterprise, she just happened to be doing it through an HOA. I watched as the detective turned Karen around, and even from 3 doors down, I could see the moment the handcuffs clicked into place. Karen's perfectly composed facade shattered completely. She was crying, protesting, trying to explain that she had only done what was best for the community, that the money was going to be paid back, that this was all a huge misunderstanding. Neighbors had started emerging from their houses, drawn by the police presence, and they stood in their yards watching the woman who had terrorized them over paint swatches and lawn ornaments being placed in the back of a police car. As the car door closed and Karen sat in the back seat, her makeup running down her face, she looked up and made direct eye contact with me standing on my porch. In that moment, I saw the exact second she understood. Her eyes widened with a recognition that went beyond just being arrested. She understood that this entire chain of events, from the investigation to the property purchase to the state complaint, had all originated from her decision to wage war against me over a security camera. She had poked the wrong person, someone with the knowledge, resources, and patience to not just fight back, but to completely dismantle her little empire using the same bureaucratic weapons she had wielded so carelessly. I raised my coffee mug to her in a small salute as the police car pulled away from the curb. The last thing I saw before the car turned the corner was Karen's face, a mixture of shock, horror, and the dawning realization that her reign as HOA president had not just ended, it had resulted in her facing felony charges that could send her to prison. The neighborhood was silent for a moment after the police cars left, then people started talking, gathering in small groups, processing what they had just witnessed. Several neighbors walked over to thank me, though I deflected credit, pointing out that Karen had done this to herself. I had simply made sure the appropriate authorities knew about it. Within hours, the story spread through the entire community. Within days, it made the local news. Former HOA president arrested for embezzlement and fraud, the headlines read. The reporters loved it, a story about suburban power run amok, complete with the detail about how it had all unraveled because she had targeted someone who knew exactly how to fight back within the system. If you have enjoyed this epic tale of HOA karma, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Karen Eat World. We have got plenty more stories about entitled people learning that actions have consequences. Drop a comment and let me know, have you ever dealt with an HOA nightmare? How did you handle it? And remember, sometimes the best revenge is not stooping to their level, it is rising above it with a better understanding of the rules than they ever had. Thanks for listening, and I will see you in the next story.